The egg had cracked too early. That was the first thing Sara noticed when she walked into the birthing chamber that morning. The shell fragments were scattered unevenly across the warm stone floor, edges jagged and sharp, the way they looked when something had gone wrong inside. A healthy drake egg broke in clean, wide pieces. This one had split like it had been dropped. She stood near the doorway and said nothing. She was a guest here. A human in an alien sanctum, part of a quiet exchange program that most of the Sorek healers still did not fully understand. Her job was to observe, to learn, and occasionally to share what she knew. It was not her place to speak first in another healer's chamber. So she watched. The birthing platform was a wide slab of pale stone in the center of the room, carved with old symbols along its edges. On it lay Thessavorn, the mother. She was a large drake, broad across the shoulders, with dark green scales that caught the lantern light and turned it deep blue near the edges. She had been in labor since the previous evening. 14 hours. Sara had checked on her twice through the night and had seen the exhaustion building slowly behind those golden eyes, the way a strong creature grows quiet when it has given everything it has. The hatchling lay at the foot of the platform. It was tiny. Smaller than Sara had expected. She had read everything the Sanctum Library had about drake births before she arrived, and she knew hatchlings were small, but this one looked fragile in a way that made her chest tighten. Its scales were pale, almost gray. Its wings were folded flat and still. Its small chest was not moving. Elder Soreth stood over it with his hands clasped behind his back. He was the head physician of the sanctum, old and careful and deeply respected among every species that used this place. His scales were a deep amber color and his yellow eyes moved slowly and deliberately, the way they always did when he was thinking. He examined the hatchling without touching it, leaning close, turning his head from one side to the other. Then he straightened up. "The flame sac has collapsed," he said. His voice was low and even. The lungs did not form fully. The shell broke 3 hours before it should have and the hatchling was not ready for the outside air. He paused. "It is beyond saving." He stepped back. The two younger Sorek healers beside him stepped back at the same time, the way students follow their teacher without thinking. It was automatic. Soreth had spoken, and when Soreth spoke in that tone, the matter was settled. Aelith moved forward. She was the Elvari Mender assigned to the birth, tall and pale with silver-white hair pinned back from her face. The Elvari were ancient healers, gifted with something the Sorek called deep sense, an ability to feel the life energy of a living creature and guide it gently. They were also the ones who performed the mourning rite when a life ended before it truly began. She reached into the cloth bag at her side and drew out a length of soft white fabric. The blessing cloth. Sara had read about this too. Across the room, Thessavorn made no sound. She had opened her eyes when Soreth spoke. Now she was staring at the ceiling, jaw set hard, the muscles in her great neck pulled tight. She did not look at the hatchling. Sara understood why. Some things are too heavy to look at directly. Sara should have stayed by the door. She knew that. She was aware, in the careful and professional part of her mind, that she was a guest, that she had no standing here, that Soreth had centuries of experience and she had none with Drake specifically. She knew all of this clearly and completely. But she had not looked away from the hatchling since she walked in. And she had seen something. It was almost nothing. A single movement, barely there, like the twitch of a muscle in deep sleep. Just beneath the hatchling's ribcage, in the area where the flame sac sat. So small that if she had blinked at the wrong moment she would have missed it entirely. She had not blinked. She had been watching too carefully. She crossed the room. Aelith looked up sharply. Soreth turned with that slow, deliberate stillness of his. "Dr. Calloway," he said. "The mourning rite has begun." "I know," Sara said. "I need 1 minute." She crouched down beside the hatchling without waiting for an answer. She pulled off her outer glove and pressed 2 fingers very lightly against the small chest, just below the ribcage. She closed her eyes. She slowed her own breathing down and held very still, and she counted. The room was quiet. She counted to 10. Then to 15. Then she felt it. Faint. So faint it was almost nothing at all. But it was there. A tiny, struggling beat, like something tapping very softly on a closed door, asking to be let in. She opened her eyes. "This hatchling is not dead," she said. Nobody spoke for a moment. Soreth came and stood behind her. "The flame sac is collapsed. Without it functioning, the body cannot sustain heat. The lungs are weak," Sara said. "Not gone." She looked up at him. "I have worked with animals my whole career. Creatures that cannot tell you they are in pain, cannot ask you for help, cannot even open their eyes to look at you. I learned a long time ago that the body fights harder than we expect it to. This one is still fighting." She held his gaze. "I can see it." Soreth looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not change. "What you are describing is not possible by the standards of our knowledge." "I know," Sara said simply. "But it is happening anyway." She stood up and turned toward the door. Tom Briggs was already there. He was her assistant, 26 years old, with a broad honest face and the very useful quality of never panicking at bad moments. He was holding the large equipment bag over one shoulder, because he had seen Sara's posture from the hallway and had known without being told. "Right here," he said. "Silver thermal wrap, the emergency one. And find the small pump kit." Aelith stepped forward, the blessing cloth still in her hands. "Dr. Calloway, you are interrupting a sacred rite. Whatever you believe you felt." "I felt a heartbeat," Sara said, already pulling on fresh gloves. "A faint one. But a heartbeat." She looked at Aelith steadily and without anger. "If I am wrong, you can finish the rite in 10 minutes and nothing is lost. But if I am right, and we do nothing, then something is lost that we cannot get back." Aelith said nothing. Soreth said nothing. Thessavorn, at the far end of the room, had turned her head. She was looking at Sara now, those great golden eyes steady and exhausted and carefully, painfully hopeful. Sara turned back to the hatchling. She had work to do. Tom moved fast. That was one of the things Sara valued most about him. He did not ask unnecessary questions when time was short. He did not stand and wait for a full explanation. He read the situation, he read her face, and he moved. By the time Sara had her gloves on and her mind organized, Tom had the bag open on the floor and was pulling items out carefully, setting them in a neat row the way she had trained him to do. The silver thermal wrap came out first. Then the small hand pump with the thin flexible tube attached to it. Then the temperature monitor, a flat disc the size of a coin that gave readings every few seconds. Then the heating coils, thin copper ones meant for emergency field work, the kind that could be shaped and bent and connected quickly without tools. Soreth watched all of this from a few steps away. "What is that material?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Thermal wrap," Sara said, already cutting a length of it with small scissors. "It reflects body heat back inward. We use it for premature animals, ones that cannot regulate their own temperature yet." She cut a second piece and handed it to Tom. "Fold that one double and shape it into a base. Wide enough for the hatchling to lie flat." Tom nodded and got to work on the floor. "The hatchling has no body heat to reflect," Soreth said. "Then we give it some from outside first," Sara said. "That is what the coils are for." She could feel Soreth watching her hands as she worked. He was not hostile exactly. He was the kind of person who observed everything carefully before deciding what he thought, and right now he was observing her the way he might observe an unfamiliar plant, trying to work out if it was useful or dangerous. Aelith had not moved from her spot near the platform. She still held the blessing cloth. Her expression was careful and cool. "You are building a nest," Aelith said. "An incubator," Sara said. "Similar idea. This hatchling's flame sac is collapsed. Even if you warm the body from the outside, the internal systems are not functional. You are treating the outside of a problem that lives on the inside." Sara did not argue. She understood the logic. She had thought the same thing herself for one brief moment when she first crouched beside the hatchling. But that heartbeat had answered the argument before she could finish forming it. "You are correct that the flame sac is the core problem," Sara said, keeping her voice even and respectful. "But a collapsed sac is not always a destroyed one. Sometimes it needs pressure and warmth applied from the outside to remind it how to work. I have seen it in young reptiles on Earth. Not drakes. I know drakes are different. But the basic biology has similarities." "You are guessing," Aelith said quietly. "I am making an informed decision with the information I have," Sara said. "That is all any healer ever does." Aelith said nothing more. But she did not leave either. Tom had the base shaped. Sara set the heating coils carefully along the inner edges, bending them in a rough oval, then connected the small power cell from the bag. The coils began to glow a dull orange. She held her hand above them and counted seconds until the heat reached the right level. Not too hot. Warm, the way a mother's body was warm. The way an unbroken egg would have been warm from the inside. Then she lifted the hatchling. It was very light. Much lighter than it looked. She carried it carefully with both hands, supporting the head and the base of the tail the way the library texts had described, and she laid it gently into the center of the incubator. She folded the thermal wrap loosely over the top, leaving an opening for air. For a moment she just looked at it. The tiny chest was still moving. Barely. But still. Good, she thought. Stay with me. Sorith came closer now. He crouched down on the other side of the incubator and studied the setup with those slow yellow eyes. Sara expected another objection. Instead he said, "The temperature you have chosen. How did you calculate it?" "Drake egg incubation temperature from the Sanctum records," she said. "I read everything in the library when I first arrived. I used that as a base and adjusted slightly downward because the hatchling is already out of the shell and the air in this room is dry." Sorith was quiet for a moment. "That adjustment is logical," he said. It was not praise. But from Sorith, Sara had learned, logic was the closest thing to it. The night came in slowly. The lanterns in the birthing chamber burned low and orange. The two younger Sorek healers had gone, sent away by Sorith to rest and attend to other duties. Aelith stayed for another hour, watching from the corner, then left without a word. Sorith himself stood near the doorway for a long time before he finally spoke. "You should understand," he said carefully, "that if this hatchling does not survive the night, the mother's grief will be compounded by the waiting. False hope is a cruelty in its own way." Sara looked up at him. "I know," she said. "I have thought about that. And I believe the hatchling has a chance. A real one." She held his gaze. "I would not be doing this if I did not believe that." Sorith looked at her for a long moment. Then he left. Sara and Tom were alone with the hatchling. Tom sat cross-legged on the floor a little way back, keeping an eye on the temperature monitor and writing numbers in a small notebook every few minutes. He did not talk much. He knew when Sara needed quiet to concentrate. Sara worked with her hands and her voice. Every 20 minutes she opened the thermal wrap and placed 2 fingers gently against the hatchling's chest, just below the flame sac, and applied slow careful pressure. Not hard. Rhythmic. The way a heartbeat moved. She had read that the flame sac in young drakes responded to rhythm, that the mother's heartbeat in the late stages of incubation helped the sac learn to pulse on its own. The egg had broken too early. The hatchling had missed that final lesson. Sara was trying to teach it now, from the outside, with nothing but patience and her own 2 hands. And she talked. She talked quietly, in a low steady voice, the way she had always talked to frightened animals in her clinic back home. She did not say anything important. She talked about the weather in the town where she grew up. She talked about a dog she had treated once that everyone said would not make it through surgery. She talked about the smell of rain on dry ground and the way the light looked in the early morning before anyone else was awake. She did not know if the hatchling could hear her. She did not know if it understood anything at all. But she had learned long ago that the voice itself mattered. The steadiness of it. The warmth of it. Something in a struggling creature responded to the sound of someone who was not afraid, someone who was simply there and not leaving. So she stayed. She stayed and she worked and she talked, while the lanterns burned low around her and the night moved slowly toward dawn. The darkest part of the night came somewhere around the 3rd hour. That was when Sara felt it. Not a change in the hatchling, not yet. Just a shift in the air, the way the silence in the chamber became heavier and the lantern flames burned smaller and still. It was the kind of quiet that pressed down on tired shoulders and whispered that nothing was going to change, that all this effort was just a long way of arriving at the same ending. Sara had felt that feeling before. She knew what it was. It was exhaustion pretending to be truth. She did not listen to it. She pressed her fingers gently against the hatchling's chest and counted. The heartbeat was still there. Fainter than it had been an hour ago, which scared her. But present. She adjusted the heating coils very slightly, raising the temperature by a single degree. She checked the moisture in the air near the incubator and breathed into it twice to add warmth. Small things. Careful things. The kind of adjustments that looked like nothing from the outside but meant everything to a body that was fighting to stay alive. Tom had fallen asleep sitting up against the wall, his notebook still open in his lap. Sara let him sleep. There was nothing for him to do right now that she could not do herself, and he had been awake for nearly 20 hours. She could hear his slow breathing behind her and found it oddly comforting. At least she was not alone in the room. She turned back to the hatchling and kept working. Around the 4th hour she began to worry about the flame sack in a new way. The external pressure rhythm she had been applying seemed to be doing something. The area beneath the hatchling's throat, where the sack sat, felt slightly warmer than it had at the beginning of the night. Not dramatically. Just a degree or 2 more than the surrounding tissue. She almost did not trust her own fingers. She checked 3 times, pressing carefully, moving slowly. It was warmer. She was almost certain. She did not let herself feel too much about that yet. Hope was useful in careful amounts. Too much of it too early was just another kind of distraction. She kept the rhythm going and she kept talking. She was telling the hatchling about the first animal she had ever saved when the change happened. It was so quiet that she nearly missed it. She had been watching the chest rise and fall with the gentle assistance of the hand pump, the thin tube resting just at the edge of one small nostril, pushing soft steady air. And then, between one pump and the next, the chest moved on its own. Sara stopped. She held the pump completely still and watched. The chest fell. Then it rose again. Without her help. Slow and shallow and trembling slightly, like a flame in a weak draft, but moving entirely on its own. Once. Twice. 3 times. Sara did not move for a long moment. Then she set the pump down very carefully on the floor beside her and sat back on her heels and pressed her hands flat against her knees because they had started to shake. She was not someone who cried easily. She had built a career out of keeping her hands steady and her mind clear in difficult moments. But something loosened in her chest right then, something that had been pulled tight since the moment she had walked into this chamber and seen that small still body on the floor. She breathed out slowly. "Tom," she said. He woke immediately, the way people do when they have trained themselves to sleep lightly in case they are needed. He blinked once, looked at her face, then looked at the hatchling. He watched the chest rise and fall on its own. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "There it is." "There it is," Sara agreed. Tom wrote the time in his notebook. Then he set the notebook down and they both just watched the hatchling breathe for a while, because after a night like that it seemed like the right thing to do. Word moved through the sanctum the way water moves through dry ground. Quickly and in every direction at once. Sara did not know who had been watching from the doorway, but someone had been. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the high windows of the birthing chamber, there were figures gathering quietly in the corridor outside. She became aware of them gradually. A shadow in the doorway. Then two. Then more, standing without speaking, looking in. Sorek healers in their pale robes. One of the young physicians who had left the night before. An older female healer Sara had seen in the corridor many times but never spoken to. Aelith was there too, standing at the back, her blessing cloth folded neatly over one arm. None of them came inside. None of them spoke. They simply stood and watched the hatchling breathe. Sara understood. They needed to see it with their own eyes before they could believe it. She checked the temperature in the incubator. She checked the heartbeat again, stronger now, noticeably stronger than it had been an hour ago. She lifted the thermal wrap slightly and looked at the flame sac area. The warmth there was real and growing. The sac was not fully functional yet, not by a long way, but it was responding. It was learning. She allowed herself, quietly and privately, to feel good about that. Then the corridor outside went very still. A different kind of still. The healers who had been gathered in the doorway shifted without making a sound, moving to the sides, creating a space down the middle. Sara looked up. Vaelthorn was coming. She moved slowly. The labor had taken a great deal from her and it showed in the careful way she placed each step, the slight stiffness along her left side where she had been lying on the stone platform for so many hours. But she held herself upright, the way a creature holds itself when pride is the only thing left holding the pieces together. She reached the doorway and stopped. She looked into the chamber. Her golden eyes moved from Sara to Tom to the small incubator on the floor. She stood very still. Sara could not read her expression exactly. It was not quite hope. It was more like someone standing at the edge of something deep, trying to decide whether the ground would hold. Sara sat back from the incubator and said nothing. She did not wave Vaelthorn in or speak or try to explain. She simply moved slightly to one side so the mother had a clear view. Vaelthorn stepped inside. She crossed the chamber slowly and lowered herself to the floor beside the incubator with great care, tucking her legs beneath her. She looked down at the hatchling for a long time without moving. The hatchling's chest rose. Fell. Rose again. Something moved through Vaelthorn's face. It was too large to name. It crossed her eyes and jaw and the set of her shoulders all at once, and for a moment her whole body shook with it, just once, like a tree in a single gust of wind. Then she was still. She did not leave. She folded her great dark wings in close against her body and settled herself on the floor beside her child, and she stayed. Sara went back to work beside her, checking temperatures and adjusting the coils, and neither of them spoke, and none of that mattered at all. Outside in the corridor, the gathered healers stood quietly and watched the dawn come in through the high windows. 3 days changed everything. Not loudly. Not in the way that big changes usually announce themselves, with ceremony and declaration and everyone gathering to mark the moment. It happened quietly, the way most real things happen, one small improvement at a time, each one building on the last until suddenly the thing that had seemed impossible was simply the new truth of the world. On the first day after dawn, the hatchling's breathing steadied. It was still shallow but it no longer trembled with every breath. The flame sack continued to warm slowly, responding to Sara's rhythmic pressure work, and by midday it had reached nearly half its expected temperature. Not enough. But enough to matter. On the second day the hatchling opened its eyes. They were gold, like its mother's, but lighter. Almost amber. It opened them for only a few seconds, blinking slowly against the lantern light, and then closed them again. But Sara had seen it and Tom had seen it and Vaelthorn, who had not left the chamber floor since she first walked in, had seen it too. The great drake mother made no sound. But her tail, which had been lying flat and still against the stone for 2 days, moved slowly and curled closer around the incubator. On the third day the hatchling cried. It was a small sound, thin and reedy, nothing like the strong bell ring of a healthy newborn. But it was real and it was loud enough to carry into the corridor, and Sara heard one of the healers outside make a sharp sound of surprise. The hatchling was crying because it was cold and it wanted warmth, and it knew, in whatever way a newborn creature knows anything, that warmth was supposed to come. Sara fed it through the thin tube, a warm liquid formula Tom had helped her prepare using the Sanctum's own nutritional records as a guide and Earth veterinary knowledge to fill in the gaps. The hatchling accepted it slowly at first, then with more interest. Its small throat moved as it swallowed. Its tiny claws opened and closed against the thermal wrap. Vaelthorn watched every moment of it with those steady golden eyes. It was on the morning of the third day that Soreth came back. Sara heard him before she saw him. She had learned his footsteps in the corridor. He walked with a particular deliberate pace, each step placed with care, nothing rushed, nothing careless. He appeared in the doorway of the birthing chamber and stood there for a moment, looking at the scene inside. The hatchling in its incubator. Vaelthorn on the floor. Sara cross-legged nearby with her notebook open and her temperature monitor in her hand. He came inside and sat down. Not on a chair. There were no chairs in the birthing chamber. He lowered himself to the floor the way Sara had been sitting for 3 days, which surprised her. Soreth was a formal person. Sitting on a stone floor was not something she had imagined him doing. He looked at the hatchling for a long moment. The small chest rose and fell. The amber eyes were closed, the hatchling resting after its feeding, its tiny body warmer and more settled than it had been at any point since it came into the world. Then Soreth looked at Sara. "I have been thinking," he said, "for 3 days." "About what?" Sara asked. "About you," he said simply. "And about what you did. And about why I could not have done it." Sara said nothing. She waited. Soreth was not a person who spoke carelessly. Every sentence he produced had been considered before it left his mouth. She had learned to give him the space he needed to arrive at what he actually meant. "I have practiced healing in this sanctum for 63 years, he said. "I have studied every text we hold. I have trained under the 3 greatest physicians this institution has produced. I examined that hatchling with everything I have learned in 6 decades, and I concluded it was beyond saving." He paused. "And you walked in and saw something I did not see." "I was lucky," Sara said carefully. "I was watching at the right moment." "No," Soreth said. "Luck is part of it. But it is not all of it. Luck does not explain what you did after. The incubator. The pressure work on the flame sack. The feeding method. The temperature calculations." He looked at her steadily. "None of that was luck. That was knowledge applied in a way I have never seen applied before." Sara looked down at her notebook for a moment. She thought about how to explain it honestly without sounding as though she was criticizing him or the sanctum, because she was not. She respected Soreth. She respected this place and everything it represented. "On Earth," she said slowly, "the kind of medicine I practice is called veterinary medicine. We treat animals. Creatures that have no language we can understand, no way to tell us what hurts or where or how badly. They cannot answer our questions. They cannot describe their symptoms. They cannot ask us for help. She looked up at him. So we learn to read the body directly. We learn to look at every small sign, every tiny movement, every degree of temperature and every change in breathing, and build a picture from all of it together. Because the body is always telling you something. You just have to learn how to listen to it. Soreth was very still. We also learn, Sara continued, not to stop. That is the other thing. On Earth, in the work I do, giving up is the last option. Not the first. Not even the second or third. You try everything you have. You try things that seem unlikely. You try things that other people call reckless. And you do not stop trying until the body itself tells you clearly and completely that the fight is over. She paused. That hatchling had not told me that. So I kept going. The chamber was quiet. Vaelthorn had not moved, but Sara felt the drake's attention on her, that particular quality of stillness that meant someone was listening with their whole body. Soreth looked at the hatchling again. Something moved in his yellow eyes that Sara had not seen there before. It was not quite sadness. It was more like the expression of someone who has just understood something important about themselves, something true and a little uncomfortable. We are taught, he said quietly, that a healer must not give a patient's family false hope. That a clear declaration, even a painful one, is kinder than an uncertain wait. He was quiet for a moment. I have believed that for 63 years. It is not a wrong belief, Sara said gently. In many situations it is the right one. But not in all situations. No, she said honestly. Not in all. Soreth nodded slowly. He sat with that for a while. Outside in the corridor the sanctum went about its mourning, footsteps and low voices and the distant sound of doors. The hatchling breathed steadily in its warm nest. Then Soreth looked at Sara with those careful, ancient eyes. I would like to understand what you know, he said. The methods. The approach. The way of reading a body that you described. He paused, and for the first time since she had met him his voice carried something that sounded almost uncertain. Would you be willing to teach us? Sara looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled. Quietly and without any triumph in it at all. Yes, she said. I would like that very much. 2 weeks after the night that changed everything, Vaelthorn learned to make noise. Not the thin, reedy cry of his first days. Something fuller. Something with more intention behind it. He would open his small mouth and produce a sound somewhere between a chirp and a low rumble, and then look around the chamber with those bright amber eyes as if checking to see what effect it had produced. When Vaelthorn responded he made the sound again, louder. When Sara responded he tilted his head to one side and studied her with an expression of deep and serious curiosity, the way young creatures look at things they are still working out. Sara found it difficult not to smile every time. He was growing fast. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Drake hatchlings in good health grew quickly in their first weeks, the Sanctum record said, but Vaelthorn seemed to be making up for lost time with particular determination. His pale gray scales were darkening toward the deep green of his mother's coloring. His wings, which had been folded flat and weak in his first days, now spread and flexed when he stretched, small and translucent and catching the light in a way that made them look like thin green glass. His flame sac was working. Not fully. Not at the level it would eventually reach. But it pulsed with steady warmth now, a gentle heat that Sara could feel when she held her hand near his throat. Soreth had examined it twice in the past week and both times had straightened up from the examination with that careful stillness of his, which Sara had learned to read well enough by now to know meant he was impressed and was deciding how much to show it. The incubator had been dismantled 4 days ago. Vaelthorn no longer needed external heat. He produced enough of his own. On the morning of the 14th day, Sara was sitting in the corridor outside the birthing chamber, writing notes in her records book. The sanctum was quiet around her, the particular soft quiet of early morning before the day fully started. Tom had gone to the eastern wing to return some borrowed equipment. The corridor was empty. She heard Thessavorn moving inside the chamber. The slow deliberate steps, the careful placement of weight that the great drake had developed over 2 weeks of moving gently around a small hatchling. Then the steps came toward the doorway. Sara looked up. Thessavorn came out into the corridor. She was carrying Vaelthorn against her chest, cradled in both forearms the way Sara had shown her in the first days, supporting the head and the base of the tail. He was awake, looking around with interest at the corridor ceiling, one small claw curled loosely around his mother's thumb. Thessavorn stopped in front of Sara. Sara closed her notebook and waited. She did not know what was coming, but something in the deliberateness of Thessavorn's movement told her it was important. The Drake mother did not do anything without intention. Every action she took was considered. That was something Sara had understood about her from the very beginning. Thessavorn looked at Sara for a long moment. Her golden eyes were steady and clear. Not passing him over for a medical check. Simply holding him forward, toward Sara, with both arms, in a gesture so open and unguarded that it took Sara a moment to understand what she was seeing. She was being trusted with him. Sara set her notebook on the floor. She stood up slowly and held out her arms the way Thessavorn had seen her do many times over the past 2 weeks. Thessavorn placed Vaelthorn into them carefully, making sure the weight was supported, making sure the transfer was smooth and gentle. And then she stepped back. Vaelthorn looked up at Sara with those amber eyes. He made his noise, the chirp rumble, and tilted his head to one side. Sara looked down at him and felt something move through her that she did not have a precise word for. It was larger than happiness and quieter than pride, and it sat in her chest like something warm and permanent. "Hello," she said softly. "Look at you." He made the noise again and reached up with one small claw and touched her chin very lightly, the way hatchlings explore unfamiliar things, carefully and with great concentration. Behind her she heard footsteps. She turned slightly and found that the corridor was no longer empty. Soreth was there, and Aelith, and several of the Sanctum healers who had gathered in the doorway on the morning the hatchling first breathed on its own. They had not planned this. They had simply appeared, drawn by some quiet awareness that something was happening worth witnessing. Soreth looked at Vaelthorn in Sara's arms. Then he looked at Thessavorn. Something passed between them, a look of acknowledgement, though what exactly was acknowledged Sara could not have said. Perhaps it was simply the fact of the moment itself. The thing that should not have happened, happening. Tom appeared at the far end of the corridor, saw the gathering, and stopped. He looked at Sara holding Vaelthorn. He looked at the assembled healers. Then he leaned quietly against the wall and folded his arms and smiled the way he always smiled when things worked out, privately and without any fuss. The changes that came after were real and lasting. Soreth began his teaching sessions with Sara the following week. They met every morning in the Sanctum library, Sara with her veterinary records and earth medical texts, Soreth with 6 decades of Vaelthorn knowledge, and they traded what they knew across the table between them with the careful respect of 2 people who had understood that neither of them had the whole picture alone. Aelith joined after the 3rd session. She did not explain why. She simply appeared one morning and sat down and began asking questions, and Sara answered them as clearly and honestly as she could, and after a while it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The Sanctum revised its declaration protocols before the month was out. The new guidelines included something that had never appeared in a Vaelthorn medical document before. A requirement to observe for a minimum of 10 minutes before a final declaration. A checklist of secondary signs to check after the primary ones had been assessed. It was a small change on paper. In practice it meant everything. The human exchange program was expanded. What had been a quiet diplomatic gesture became a formal partnership, signed between Earth and Vaelthorn with much more ceremony than Sara was comfortable with. She sat through the ceremony anyway and shook many hands and accepted many formal words and was very glad when it was over. Vaelthorn grew. He grew the way things grow when they have decided firmly to be alive. Strong and fast and full of noise. His scales deepened to a rich dark green. His wings filled out and learned to catch air. His flame sac developed into a proper working thing that produced a small but genuine flame by the time he was 3 months old, which he demonstrated at every opportunity. He remembered Sara. That was the thing that stayed with her longest, in all the years after. He was a young drake with a mother who loved him and a sanctum full of healers who watched over him and a life that was full and warm and entirely his own. He had no reason to look for a human face in a crowd. But he always did. When Sara came to the sanctum he found her. He crossed whatever room he was in with that particular purposeful walk of his and he made his noise and he looked up at her with those amber eyes, older and brighter every time she saw them, and she would look back at him and think about the night she had sat on a cold stone floor and talked to a creature that could not hear her yet. He had heard her anyway. She was certain of it.